I understand you were a sort of early warning shot because you were denied entry to Hong Kong some years ago. What was your crime?
Well, my crime was to have spoken the truth and criticised the regime in Beijing, stood up for democracy and freedom in Hong Kong, and I went on a visit in October 2017 just to meet old friends and was told I was not welcome and put back on a plane.
It literally stopped at the border, put back on a plane?
Absolutely.
And had you written articles or broadcast, or what had you done?
Yeah, those are the worst of my crimes. I'd written articles, I'd spoken to MPs, I'd hosted people like Joshua Wong and Nathan Law in London and introduced them to MPs. So,
Stan News, was it pretty much one of the last outlets that was arguing for democracy and free speech?
It was, very, very much so. And I would say that if the closure of the Apple Daily 6 months ago was perhaps the death or the death knell of press freedom, the closure of Stan News is probably the burial of press freedom.
Yeah, I mean, Apple did get quite a lot of publicity because of Jimmy Lai. This has had some, but given our level of responsibility, given that we actually did this deal, I feel far too little. Now, I mentioned the fact in my talk-up that one of the people arrested also possessed a Canadian passport. So, clearly, if you're from Hong Kong, you're Chinese, you can't speak freely without the fear of being arrested. But what is the situation now, in your opinion, for foreign journalists based in Hong Kong who are reporting out to a wider world, either by writing for a big national newspaper, or what about even, I could be a British businessman living in Hong Kong, putting stuff out on Twitter. What are the implications for that?
The implications are very grave. And if I can just say, first of all, that not only was one of the people arrested a Canadian, one of the other people arrested, a very prominent barrister, Margaret Ng, actually has a British passport. And all the more reason why Liz Truss should be speaking out, and her silence is deafening. But in terms of journalists, there have already been a few foreign correspondents who've had their work visas denied or not renewed. And I think it's only going to get worse. We see the harassment of foreign correspondents in mainland China, and I think that's to come in Hong Kong.
But in a way, one of the liberating things about the internet, and it certainly helped my career because I could get round the back of mainstream media and deliver a message directly to an audience. To what extent can China control, shut down the internet?
Well, I think it certainly can. Whether it will go the whole way in terms of imposing its what's known as the Great Firewall of China in Hong Kong, or whether it will be more targeted, taking down certain websites, blocking them, going after people who've posted or tweeted things, I don't know. But some of that targeted harassment is already happening. And one thing I should add to your earlier question is, of course, the very draconian national security law actually has an extraterritorial component to it. So certainly if you're a foreigner living in Hong Kong and you tweet something, I mean, having a foreign passport is not going to protect you. But even in theory, I'm breaking the national security law, as are you, probably every day, sitting here in London. Now, they're unlikely to be able to reach us here, but nevertheless, it does have extraterritorial.
And sedition is what Stan News were accused of.
That's right.
And what is their definition of sedition? Any criticism?
Pretty much any criticism. I mean, all Stan News did was to report stories that any decent media organisation would do, interview people who are critical of the regime, publish op-eds by critics. That's sedition.
So there's basically what you're saying, Benedict, is there's no way back.
I think there's no way back unless something fundamental changes in the regime in Beijing. In the short term, it's very hard to see things improving in Hong Kong.
I'm afraid I rather agree with that. Now, one of the reasons for the silence, and I'm not particularly putting Liz Truss in the frame here directly, but it is fascinating. I've sat here, and in that chair has sat Vince Cable, Stanley Johnson, pillars of the British establishment who are extremely loath to be critical of the communist regime. Yes, they'll criticise a bit, but not really critical. And I've been fascinated. Overnight we learned that Huawei, that great communications company, have actually given twice as much funding to British universities as previous figures had been published. A further £28.7 million has been taken up by 9 leading UK universities. That's on top of the money we understood they'd taken before. So what we see are Chinese companies, and there's no such thing as an independent Chinese company in a communist state, and we know that and we get that, giving money directly through academia, putting on its advisory boards former senior politicians, former big businessmen, former civil servants. I mean, it feels to me, and you may say that I'm being a bit over the top, but it feels to me like there are significant sections of the British establishment who effectively are bought and paid for, and that's why they're so quiet.
I agree with you. It certainly feels that way to me. And if you remember, at the start of 2020, Boris Johnson and the British government were seriously proposing to give Huawei the major role in 5G. Now, thankfully, there was a strong parliamentary rebellion over that. There was also pressure from our US and Australia and other friends.
There was a phone call from Donald Trump.
There was.
I'd love to have overheard the language that was used on that one.
Absolutely. But no, I mean, on a more positive note, what I would say is that in the last few years, I think we have seen a shift, certainly in Parliament, maybe not so much in Whitehall, in that a few years ago, the voices in Parliament speaking out on this were very few. Now there are, across the spectrum, from Ian Duncan Smith to Tom Tugendhat to people on the Labour and Lib Dem benches. So that's encouraging.
Well, and I think in the country too.
Yeah.
I think this is one of those issues where actually Westminster and the media are behind public opinion. Yeah. I think the Western world has woken up and has got real concerns about China. I think British consumers would like to buy fewer Chinese goods if they can, but it's quite difficult when you go on Amazon and order something because you don't know where it's been manufactured. And I think this is an issue in American politics now that has become very significant, and it will grow here, I think, too. Thank you very much indeed, Benedict, for coming in and sharing your knowledge, although it is, I have to say, a pretty depressing tale. But thank you very much. Indeed.